Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight we're diving into something darker than you might expect. A dynasty so drenched in blood that the scaffold became as iconic as the crown itself. We're talking about the Tudors. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video if you enjoy these deep dives into history's shadows. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always love seeing our community from around the world. Now, settle in, maybe dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Here's something they don't tell you in history class. The Tudor dynasty, those 5 rulers who sat on England's throne from 1485 to 1603, collectively executed somewhere between 57,000 and 72,000 people. Let that number sink in for a moment. Not casualties of war, not deaths from disease, executions, sanctioned killings ordered by royal decree. But here's where it gets even more disturbing. The methods varied wildly depending on your social class, your crime, and which Tudor happened to be in power. Some rulers barely stained their hands. Others turned England into an abattoir. What's truly chilling isn't just the numbers. It's how casually death was administered, how normalized it became, how the smell of burning flesh and the sound of the axe became the background noise of an era. And the question that haunts historians to this day, which Tudor ruler had the most blood on their hands? The answer might surprise you. Before we count the dead, we need to understand how they died. Tudor England offered a spectacular variety of execution methods, each carefully calibrated to match the crime and the criminal's social standing. This wasn't random violence, it was theatre. Every death was a message written in blood. At the top of the hierarchy sat beheading. This was the gentleman's exit, reserved for nobility and those of high rank. The condemned would kneel at the block, say a few final words, often praising the king or queen who just ordered their death, because irony was apparently mandatory, and then the axe would fall. In theory, it was quick. One clean stroke. In practice, the executioner's skill varied wildly. Anne Boleyn, second wife of Henry VIII, was lucky. She got a French swordsman specially imported from Calais, who took her head off with a single stroke. Clean, professional, almost merciful by Tudor standards. The Countess of Salisbury, an elderly woman in her late 60s, wasn't so fortunate. Her executioner was inexperienced. It took 11 blows to kill her. She ran from the block, and the executioner chased her around the scaffold, hacking at her neck and shoulders while she screamed. Witnesses were traumatized. Henry VIII, who'd ordered her death, probably didn't lose sleep over it. Then we have hanging, not the quick drop method used later, where the neck snaps and death is relatively swift. Tudor hanging was slow strangulation. You were hauled up by the neck and left to kick and thrash while the crowd watched. Your face would turn purple, then black. Your tongue would protrude, your bowels would empty, and you'd slowly suffocate, which could take anywhere from 10 to 20 agonizing minutes. But hanging was merciful compared to what came next for some criminals. Hanging, drawing, and quartering. This was reserved for traitors, and it was designed to be the most horrific death imaginable. First, you were hanged, but cut down before you died. While you were still conscious, the executioner would slice open your abdomen and pull out your intestines while you watched. Then your genitals would be cut off and burned in front of your face. Only after all that would you be beheaded. Your body would then be cut into 4 pieces, quartered, and displayed in different parts of the city as a warning. Women convicted of treason faced a different horror, burning at the stake. Not because it was more merciful, it absolutely wasn't, but because the spectacle of disemboweling a woman was considered too indecent for public viewing. So instead, they tied you to a post, piled wood around your feet, and set it aflame. If you were lucky, the smoke would suffocate you before the flames reached you. If you weren't, you'd burn alive, your skin blistering and peeling, your hair catching fire, your screams eventually giving way to silence as your lungs seared from the inside out. And these weren't rare, shocking events. They were scheduled entertainment. Crowds gathered. Children watched. Vendors sold snacks. Execution day was like a public holiday. A chance to see justice, or what passed for justice, in action. Now, with that cheerful context established, let's meet our executioners in chief. The 5 Tudor monarchs who wielded these tools of death with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Henry Tudor, who would become Henry VII, didn't inherit his throne. He took it. On August 22nd, 1485, at the Battle of Bosworth Field, his forces defeated King Richard III, and Henry, a relatively unknown Welsh nobleman with a tenuous claim to the throne, suddenly became King of England. His reign started with blood. It would continue that way, but with a surprising degree of restraint compared to what would come later. Henry VII ruled for 24 years, from 1485 to 1509, and during that time he executed somewhere between 200 and 300 people. Now that sounds like a lot, and it is, but by Tudor standards, it's practically pacifist. What's fascinating about Henry VII isn't just the relatively low body count, it's his precision. He didn't kill randomly or in fits of rage. Every execution was calculated, strategic, a chess move designed to eliminate threats to his shaky claim to the throne. See, Henry's problem was legitimacy. His claim to the crown came through his mother, Margaret Beaufort, whose lineage traced back to John of Gaunt. But that line had been declared illegitimate by an Act of Parliament decades earlier. Technically, Henry had about as much right to be king as a random blacksmith from Cornwall. So he had to be ruthless, but smart about it. His first major wave of executions came immediately after Bosworth. Men who'd fought for Richard III, the losing side, faced treason charges. Some were executed immediately, others were imprisoned, their lands confiscated, their families ruined. Henry made it clear, oppose me and you die. But here's where Henry showed his cleverness. He didn't go on a massacre spree. Instead, he used the threat of execution like a scalpel. He'd charge people with treason, sentence them to death, and then pardon them at the last moment, or commute their sentence to imprisonment, or fine them so heavily they'd never recover financially. It was psychological warfare. Everyone knew the axe hung over their heads. No one could feel truly safe, and that fear kept rebellion to a minimum. Still, some had to die. High-profile threats, pretenders to the throne, anyone who gathered too much support, they got the block. The most famous of Henry's victims, probably Perkin Warbeck, a young man who claimed to be Richard, Duke of York, one of the princes in the Tower. For years, Warbeck gathered support across Europe, launching invasions and stirring up rebellions. Henry eventually captured him, kept him prisoner in the Tower of London for 2 years, and then, when Warbeck allegedly tried to escape, had him hanged at Tyburn in 1499. Around the same time, Henry also executed Edward Plantagenet, Earl of Warwick, the nephew of Edward IV and Richard III. Edward had been imprisoned since childhood, literally since he was 10 years old, because he had a better claim to the throne than Henry did. He'd done nothing wrong. He wasn't plotting rebellion. He was just alive. And his existence was a threat, so Henry had him beheaded. Problem solved. Henry VII's executions were strategic eliminations. He didn't kill for sport or pleasure, or even ideology. He killed to secure his dynasty, to make sure his son, another Henry, who we'll get to in a moment, would inherit a stable throne. And in that, he succeeded. When Henry VII died in 1509, his son took the crown without opposition. The Tudor dynasty was secure. The price? A few hundred lives, give or take. By Tudor standards, a bargain. But here's the truly chilling part. Henry VII set the precedent. He normalised the idea that the monarch's security justified any level of bloodshed. He taught his son that killing threats, real or imagined, was just part of the job. And his son? His son would take that lesson and run with it straight into a bloodbath that would dwarf anything his father had done. Henry VIII is the Tudor everyone knows, 6 wives, 2 beheaded, the break with Rome, the dissolution of the monasteries, a larger-than-life figure whose appetites for food, for women, for power were as legendary as his cruelty. But here's what the pop culture versions usually gloss over. Henry VIII was a mass murderer. During his 38-year reign, from 1509 to 1547, Henry VIII executed somewhere between 57,000 and 72,000 people. Let me repeat that. 57,000 to 72,000 executions. That's not a typo. That's not historians exaggerating. That's the best estimate, based on court records, contemporary accounts, and parish death registers. To put it in perspective, Henry VIII killed more people than the French Revolution's reign of terror. He killed more people than the Spanish Inquisition did in a century. He turned England into a killing field, and he did it with the full backing of Parliament and the Church. Well, his church, the one he created so he could get a divorce. When Henry came to the throne in 1509, he was young, athletic, charismatic, and relatively merciful. Early in his reign, he pardoned criminals, showed leniency, and seemed like he might be a benevolent ruler. That didn't last. The executions started slowly. Political rivals, inconvenient nobles, a few priests who spoke out against the king's policies. But then came the break with Rome in the 1530s and everything escalated. Henry decided he wanted to divorce his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, because she hadn't given him a male heir. The Pope refused. So Henry, in a move that would have been breathtaking in its audacity if it weren't so terrifying, declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, annulled his own marriage, and married Anne Boleyn. Anyone who objected, they died. Sir Thomas More, former Lord Chancellor, one of the most respected intellectuals in Europe, beheaded for refusing to recognise Henry as head of the Church. John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, an elderly man in his 70s, beheaded for the same reason. The Carthusian monks who refused to swear the oath of supremacy, hanged, drawn, and quartered. Some of them were chained upright in prison and left to starve to death first, just to make the point extra clear. But the real bloodbath began with the dissolution of the monasteries. Between 1536 and 1541, Henry VIII systematically dismantled every monastery, abbey and priory in England. He confiscated their lands, their wealth, their libraries. Monks and nuns were turned out, left homeless. Many were executed for resisting. And when the common people rose up in rebellion, most notably in the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536, a massive uprising in the north of England protesting the destruction of the monasteries, Henry's response was merciless. He promised pardons, negotiations, and a fair hearing. Once the rebels dispersed and went home, he broke his word. Leaders were arrested and executed. Entire villages were punished. Estimates suggest that around 200 to 250 people were executed in the aftermath, including abbots, monks, and commoners. But that's just the high-profile cases. The true scale of Henry's killing went far beyond rebellions and religious disputes. Tudor England had brutal laws for even minor crimes. Theft could be a capital offence, so could poaching, or being a vagabond, homeless and unemployed. Under Henry VIII, the number of people hanged for theft, vagrancy, and other petty crimes skyrocketed. Why? Because Henry's policies created poverty. The dissolution of the monasteries didn't just destroy religious institutions. Monasteries had been the social safety net of medieval England. They ran hospitals, provided food for the poor, offered shelter to travellers. When Henry destroyed them, he created a wave of homelessness and hunger. And then he executed the homeless for being homeless. It was a vicious cycle. Economic policies created poverty. Poverty created crime. Crime was punishable by death. and the scaffold stayed busy. Then there are the wives, because we can't talk about Henry VIII without talking about the wives. Catherine of Aragon, divorced but survived. Anne Boleyn, beheaded in 1536 on charges of adultery, treason, and incest. The charges were almost certainly fabricated. Her real crime? She didn't give him a son, and he wanted to marry someone else. Jane Seymour died in childbirth, so no execution necessary, though Henry probably would have found a reason eventually. Anne of Cleves, divorced, survived. Catherine Howard, beheaded in 1542, also on charges of adultery. She was 19 years old. Catherine Parr survived by outliving him, which was honestly the smartest move any of Henry's wives made. But it wasn't just the wives. Henry executed friends, advisors, and allies who'd served him loyally for years. Thomas Cromwell, his chief minister, the architect of the Reformation, the man who made Henry's break with Rome possible, beheaded in 1540 because Henry changed his mind about policy and needed a scapegoat. The Duke of Buckingham, one of the highest-ranking nobles in England, beheaded in 1521 on flimsy charges of treason. Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, a poet and soldier, beheaded in 1547, just days before Henry's own death, essentially for no reason other than Henry was paranoid and vindictive. By the end of his reign, Henry VIII was a bloated, paranoid tyrant, his leg oozing with infected ulcers, his mind twisted by pain and megalomania. He killed without hesitation, without remorse, and often without reason. When he died in January 1547, he left behind a traumatized kingdom, a decimated nobility, and a legacy soaked in blood. And the throne passed to his 9-year-old son. Edward VI was 9 years old when he became king, a child, a quiet, studious, pious boy who loved theology and learning and had absolutely no interest in the brutal politics that had defined his father's reign. His reign lasted just 6 years, from 1547 to 1553, and during that time, Edward executed almost no one. Wait, what? Yes, the son of the most murderous king in English history was, by comparison, shockingly merciful. Now, to be clear, Edward didn't actually govern. He was a child. Real power rested with his uncle, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, who acted as Lord Protector. And then, after Somerset was overthrown in 1549, power shifted to John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. Both men were ambitious, ruthless, and willing to do whatever it took to maintain control. But neither launched mass executions. Under Edward's reign, or rather under the regency that ruled in his name, there were scattered executions. Political rivals were eliminated. Somerset himself was eventually executed in 1552 after falling from power. Religious dissenters faced the stake, particularly Anabaptists, who were burned as heretics. But the scale was nothing like Henry VIII, maybe a few dozen executions during the entire 6-year reign. Compared to his father's tens of thousands, it was practically a vacation. Why so few? Part of it was Edward's personality. He was deeply religious, a committed Protestant who genuinely believed in mercy and forgiveness. He read the Bible constantly and took its teachings seriously. He wasn't bloodthirsty. He wasn't paranoid. He was just a kid trying to be a good king. But there's another factor: stability. Edward's claim to the throne was undisputed. He was Henry VIII's legitimate son, the long-awaited male heir. No one challenged his right to rule. Without threats, there was no need for mass executions. The regents who actually ran the government were more focused on consolidating Protestant reforms, making sure England stayed firmly Protestant after Henry's chaotic religious policies, than on eliminating political enemies. Of course, Edward's reign wasn't without violence. There were uprisings, including Kett's Rebellion in 1549, a massive peasant revolt in Norfolk. The government crushed it brutally, and the leaders were hanged. But that was military suppression of rebellion, not the kind of systematic judicial executions that defined his father's reign. Edward VI died in July 1553, just 15 years old, probably from the tuberculosis. On his deathbed, manipulated by Northumberland, he tried to alter the succession to prevent his Catholic half-sister Mary from taking the throne. It didn't work. Mary took the crown anyway, and she brought her own ideas about how to deal with heretics. Mary I became queen in July 1553, and from the beginning, her reign was driven by one overriding obsession: restoring England to the Catholic faith. Her father, Henry VIII, had broken with Rome. Her brother, Edward VI, had pushed England further into Protestantism. Now Mary, a devout Catholic who'd suffered years of humiliation and exclusion because of her faith, was determined to undo it all, and she was willing to burn anyone who stood in her way. Mary's reign lasted just 5 years, from 1553 to 1558. In that time, she executed approximately 280 to 300 people. Now, compared to her father's body count, that sounds almost reasonable. But here's the thing: nearly all of Mary's executions were for religious reasons, and the method she preferred was burning at the stake. Mary didn't just want obedience, she wanted souls. She genuinely believed that heretics, Protestants who refused to convert back to Catholicism, were damned, and she believed that by burning them, she might save others from following their example. In her mind, she was being merciful. She was saving England's soul. In reality, she was creating martyrs. The burnings began in 1555. The first victims were high-profile Protestant leaders. Bishop John Hooper, burned at Gloucester, Bishop Hugh Latimer and Bishop Nicholas Ridley, burned together at Oxford. Latimer's famous last words to Ridley as the flames rose: "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day light such a candle, by God's grace, in England, as I trust shall never be put out." He was right. The executions backfired spectacularly. Then came Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, the man who'd annulled Henry VIII's marriage to Catherine of Aragon and declared Mary illegitimate. Mary wanted him broken. She wanted him to recant, to publicly renounce Protestantism, to admit he'd been wrong, and she got it. After months of psychological torture, Cranmer signed multiple recantations, grovelling statements declaring his Protestant beliefs heretical. Mary, satisfied, scheduled his execution anyway. But at the stake, Cranmer did something unexpected. He recanted his recantations. He thrust his right hand, the one that had signed the false confessions, into the flames first, declaring it must burn before the rest of him, because it had sinned. It was powerful theatre, and it turned Cranmer from a man who'd cracked under pressure into a martyr who'd found his courage at the end. But Mary didn't just burn bishops and theologians. She burned commoners, labourers, women, teenagers. In 1556, she ordered the execution of 17 Protestants in a single day in Canterbury. Among them was a woman named Joan Waste, who was blind. She'd learnt the Bible by having it read aloud to her, and she refused to recant her Protestant beliefs. They burned her alive, a blind woman whose only crime was her faith. There were pregnant women burned at the stake. There were men who recanted to save their families, then were burned anyway. There were cases where entire towns were forced to watch as their neighbours died, the smell of burning flesh hanging in the air for days. And with each execution, Mary became more hated. Protestants began calling her Bloody Mary, a nickname that stuck. Pamphlets circulated describing the burnings in graphic detail, painting Mary as a tyrant, a monster, a murderer. But Mary didn't see it that way. To her, she was doing God's work. She was cleansing England of heresy. She believed, truly believed, that history would vindicate her. It didn't. When Mary died in November 1558, childless and despised, England breathed a collective sigh of relief. The fires went out, the persecution ended, and the throne passed to her half-sister, Elizabeth. The question everyone asked, would Elizabeth continue the bloodshed, or would she find another way? Elizabeth I became queen in November 1558, and she inherited a kingdom torn apart by religion, paranoia, and fear. Her father, Henry VIII, had created the Church of England and killed anyone who disagreed. Her half-sister Mary had tried to drag England back to Catholicism and burned hundreds of Protestants. Now Elizabeth, a Protestant herself, had to find a middle ground that wouldn't lead to civil war. She ruled for 45 years, from 1558 to 1603. And during that time, she executed somewhere between 600 and 800 people. That's higher than Edward VI, higher than Mary I, but nowhere near her father's apocalyptic body count. What's fascinating about Elizabeth isn't just the numbers, it's her strategy. She didn't kill impulsively or emotionally. She killed carefully, deliberately, and only when she thought it was absolutely necessary. Elizabeth understood something her siblings hadn't. Martyrs were dangerous. Every execution created a story, a symbol, a rallying point for the opposition. So she tried to avoid creating martyrs whenever possible. Instead of mass religious persecution, she offered a compromise. The Elizabethan religious settlement established a moderate form of Protestantism. Catholics could keep their faith privately as long as they didn't openly challenge the Queen's authority. Most people accepted it. But for those who didn't, for the extremists, the plotters, the would-be assassins, Elizabeth's justice was swift and brutal. Her first major crisis came early. In 1569, the Northern Rebellion, an uprising of Catholic nobles who wanted to replace Elizabeth with her Catholic cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, erupted in the north of England. Elizabeth crushed it, ruthlessly. Around 600 to 800 rebels were executed, most by hanging. Their bodies were left on display as warnings, but even this was strategic. Elizabeth wanted to make an example, to show that rebellion meant death, but she also needed to restore order quickly. So she pardoned lower-level participants and focused her wrath on the ringleaders. Then there was Mary, Queen of Scots herself. Mary was Elizabeth's cousin, a Catholic queen who'd been forced to flee Scotland after a series of scandals and civil wars. She sought refuge in England, expecting hospitality. Instead, Elizabeth kept her prisoner for 19 years. Why not just execute her immediately? Because Mary was anointed royalty. Executing a queen set a dangerous precedent. Elizabeth, always conscious of optics, hesitated, but Mary kept plotting. Letter after letter, conspiracy after conspiracy, always aiming to overthrow Elizabeth and claim the English throne. Finally, in 1586, Mary was caught red-handed in the Babington plot, a scheme to assassinate Elizabeth. The evidence was undeniable. Even then, Elizabeth hesitated. She signed Mary's death warrant, then refused to send it. She signed it again, then claimed she hadn't meant to. Her advisors, exasperated, sent the warrant without her explicit approval. Mary, Queen of Scots, was beheaded in February 1587. It took 3 blows. The first struck the back of her head, the second hit her neck, but didn't sever it. The third finally separated her head from her body. When the executioner lifted her head to show the crowd, her auburn hair, actually a wig, came off in his hand, revealing Mary's real hair, which was grey and thinning. Her little dog, which had hidden in her skirts, crawled out from under her dress and lay in the pool of blood, refusing to leave. Elizabeth, when she heard the news, publicly wept and claimed she'd never meant for the execution to happen. Privately, she was relieved. The greatest threat to her throne was gone. But Mary's death created a new problem. It gave Catholic Spain an excuse to invade. The Spanish Armada sailed in 1588, the largest invasion force ever assembled against England. Elizabeth's speech to her troops at Tilbury became legendary. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." England won. The Armada was destroyed by storms and English naval tactics. Elizabeth's legend grew. But the victories came with costs. Catholic priests were hunted down and executed as traitors. Jesuit missionaries, caught smuggling into England to minister to secret Catholics, were hanged, drawn, and quartered. Elizabeth also executed Protestant extremists, Puritans who wanted to push religious reform further than she was willing to go. She had no patience for zealots of any faith. And then there were the political executions. The Earl of Essex, once Elizabeth's favourite courtier, possibly even her lover, led a failed rebellion in 1601. He was arrested and beheaded. It broke Elizabeth's heart, but she signed the warrant anyway. By the end of her reign, Elizabeth was an old woman, her face painted white with lead makeup to hide the ravages of time, her teeth blackened from sugar, her body bent with age. She'd outlived all her siblings. She'd outlived most of her enemies. She'd turned England into a global power, defeated the Spanish, presided over a cultural golden age that produced Shakespeare and Marlowe. And she'd done it all while executing fewer people than any other Tudor except Edward VI. When she died in March 1603, childless and alone, the Tudor dynasty died with her. But the question remains, who was the bloodiest Tudor? So let's tally the dead. Henry VII, 200 to 300 executions. Calculated, strategic, mostly political. The lowest body count of any Tudor. Edward VI, fewer than 100 executions. A boy king in a relatively stable period kept the bloodshed minimal. Mary I, 280 to 300 executions. Nearly all religious, nearly all by burning. Created martyrs and earned the nickname Bloody Mary. Elizabeth I, 600 to 800 executions. Spread over 45 years, mostly political and strategic, designed to neutralise threats without creating mass persecution. Henry VIII, 57,000 to 72,000 executions. It's not even close. Henry VIII killed more people than all the other Tudors combined. By a landslide. By an order of magnitude that's almost incomprehensible. But here's what makes it even more disturbing. Henry VIII wasn't executing people in a time of war or invasion. There was no existential crisis that justified the bloodshed. He killed because he could, because it consolidated his power, because it eliminated inconveniences, because he wanted to marry someone new, or didn't like someone's political stance, or needed a scapegoat for his own failures. And he did it all legally, with Parliament's approval, wrapped in the language of justice and necessity. The other Tudors at least had ideological reasons, defending the Protestant faith, restoring Catholicism, protecting the throne. Henry VIII just had ego, and the English people, exhausted and traumatised, learned to keep their heads down, their mouths shut, and their loyalty visible. Because under the Tudors, especially under Henry VIII, one wrong word could mean death. Let's pull back for a moment and look at how this killing machine actually functioned. Executions in Tudor England weren't spontaneous. They were bureaucratic. Every death was documented, approved, scheduled. There were forms to fill out, warrants to sign, officials to bribe or intimidate. The process usually began with an accusation. Anyone could accuse anyone of anything: treason, heresy, theft, witchcraft. The accused would be arrested and thrown into prison, often the Tower of London for high-status prisoners or local jails for commoners. Then came the trial, and here's where things get darkly comedic. Tudor trials were a joke. There was no presumption of innocence, no right to a lawyer, no right to see the evidence against you. The accused couldn't even testify in their own defence in treason cases. The verdict was usually predetermined, especially in political cases where the crown wanted someone dead. The trial was just theatre, a formality to give the execution a veneer of legality. Torture was routine. The rack, thumbscrews, the scavenger's daughter, a device that compressed the body until ribs cracked, all were used to extract confessions. And once you confessed, even under torture, that confession was legally binding. If you were convicted, and you almost always were, the sentence was pronounced for traitors, hanging, drawing, and quartering. For heretics, burning. For nobles, beheading. For commoners, hanging. Then came the wait, sometimes days, sometimes weeks, sometimes months. You'd sit in a cold, filthy cell, knowing exactly how and when you were going to die. On the day of execution, you'd be led out, sometimes on foot, sometimes in a cart, to the scaffold. Crowds would gather. Thousands sometimes. Vendors sold food and drink. Children sat on their parents' shoulders to get a better view. You were expected to give a speech. A good death required a good performance. You'd praise the monarch, confess your crimes, real or fabricated, and ask for the prayers of the crowd. Then the executioner would do his work, and your body, or what was left of it, would be displayed. Heads on pikes on London Bridge. Quartered bodies sent to different towns to be hung in giblets. A warning to anyone who might be thinking of stepping out of line. This was England under the Tudors, a kingdom where death was public, ritualised, and ever-present. But here's something equally fascinating. Who survived? Because not everyone who faced the Tudor executioners died. Some managed to cheat death through luck, cunning, or sheer timing. Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, was sentenced to death by Henry VIII in 1546. His execution was scheduled for January 28, 1547. Henry VIII died on January 27th. The new regime under Edward VI quietly released Norfolk from the Tower. He lived another 7 years. Catherine Parr, Henry VIII's sixth and final wife, survived by being clever. She knew Henry was unpredictable and paranoid, so she made herself indispensable, nursing his ulcerated leg, managing his household, never openly disagreeing with him. When Henry's advisors tried to have her arrested for heresy, she found out about the plot. She immediately went to Henry, cried, told him she'd only been debating theology to distract him from his pain, and begged forgiveness. Henry bought it. Or maybe he was just too tired to execute another wife. Either way, Catherine survived. Bishop Stephen Gardiner, a conservative Catholic who served under Henry VIII and Mary I, was imprisoned by Edward VI's Protestant regime and nearly executed. But he outlived Edward, was released by Mary, and became her Lord Chancellor. Then Elizabeth took the throne, and Gardiner died of natural causes just weeks later. Timing saved him from the scaffold. Survival in Tudor England wasn't about innocence or guilt. It was about strategy, luck, and knowing when to bow and when to fight. Let's talk about what it does to a society when execution becomes routine. Tudor England was traumatised. Entire generations grew up watching people die in horrific ways. Children saw bodies hanging from gibbets on their way to market. Farmers ploughed fields within sight of execution sites where corpses rotted in cages. The psychological impact was profound. People learned to performative loyalty. You didn't just obey the crown, you visibly, loudly, enthusiastically obeyed. You informed on neighbours. You attended executions and cheered. You praised the king or queen with an intensity that bordered on hysteria. Because if you didn't, someone might notice, and that could be fatal. Trust eroded, families turned on each other, servants spied on masters, priests reported confessions to authorities, and the paranoia flowed upward too. Henry VIII's later years were marked by insane suspicion. He saw conspiracies everywhere. He had people arrested for glancing at him wrong, for not laughing at his jokes, for mentioning his health. Elizabeth I, despite being more restrained, lived in constant fear of assassination. She slept with guards outside her door. She had food tasters. She never fully trusted anyone. And the nobility, they lived in gilded prisons, always one wrong word from the scaffold. The aristocracy of Tudor England was decimated, not just by executions, but by the constant stress of surviving in a world where royal favour could evaporate overnight. Mental illness wasn't recognised or treated, but the symptoms were everywhere. Depression, anxiety, paranoia, PTSD from watching public executions. Tudor England was a kingdom suffering from collective trauma, and the scars lasted for generations. Now here's where it gets truly Orwellian. All of this was legal. The Tudors didn't just kill people randomly. They built an entire legal framework to justify it. The Treason Act of 1534, passed under Henry VIII, redefined treason so broadly that almost anything could be prosecuted. Denying the king's supremacy over the church? Treason. Refusing to swear an oath? Treason. Speaking ill of the king's marriage? Treason. And the penalty for treason was death. Mary I introduced the Heresy Acts, which made it illegal to practice Protestantism. Owning a Protestant Bible? Heresy. Attending a Protestant service? Heresy. Refusing to attend Catholic Mass? Heresy. And the penalty for heresy was burning at the stake. Elizabeth I passed laws making it treason to harbour Catholic priests. Simply allowing a Jesuit missionary to sleep in your barn could get you hanged, drawn, and quartered. Your property would be confiscated, your family impoverished, your name destroyed. But here's the genius of Tudor legal brutality. It was selective enforcement. The laws existed to threaten everyone, but they were only enforced against specific targets. This created a state of perpetual anxiety. You never knew if you were safe or not. The law was a sword hanging over every head, ready to drop at the monarch's whim. Parliament rubber-stamped everything. Bills of attainder, legislative acts declaring someone guilty of treason without trial, were routine. If the king or queen wanted you dead and couldn't make the charges stick in court, Parliament would simply pass a law declaring you a traitor. And the courts, packed with judges who owed their positions to the crown. Juries were intimidated or bribed. Verdicts were predetermined. It was legal, but it wasn't justice. The Tudor legal system was a weapon, carefully crafted and ruthlessly deployed. And it normalised state violence to a degree that would have shocked medieval England. Because even in the so-called barbaric Middle Ages, there were limits. Kings were expected to consult with their nobles. The church offered some protection. Custom and tradition placed boundaries on royal power. The Tudors shattered those boundaries. They built an absolutist state where the monarch's word was law, where dissent meant death, and where survival meant silence. And they did it all while claiming to defend England, protect the faith, and serve the common good. History remembers the famous executions. Anne Boleyn, Thomas More, Mary, Queen of Scots. Their stories are told and retold, dramatised in films and novels. But what about the thousands, whose names we don't know? The servant girl hanged for stealing a loaf of bread to feed her starving children. The farmer executed for poaching a rabbit on land that had been common ground for centuries, until enclosure laws made it the Lord's private property. The apprentice burned as a heretic because he owned a Bible in English. The vagrant, a man who'd lost his job when the monasteries closed and had nowhere to go, hanged for the crime of being homeless. Tudor execution records are incomplete. Many local hangings weren't recorded at all. Parish registers sometimes noted deaths but not causes. Court documents have been lost or destroyed. What we have are fragments, glimpses into an ocean of suffering. Consider this. In 1531, Parliament passed the Vagabonds Act, which declared that anyone caught begging who was able-bodied could be whipped and imprisoned. Repeat offenders could be executed. Thousands of people, made homeless by economic changes, by the dissolution of the monasteries, by enclosure of common lands, were suddenly criminalized for their poverty, and many of them died for it. Or consider the women executed for witchcraft. Tudor England wasn't as obsessed with witch hunting as some other European countries, but it happened. Women who practiced herbal medicine, who were too outspoken, who didn't fit social norms, they could be accused, tried, and executed. The evidence? Testimony from neighbours who didn't like them. Confessions extracted through torture or sleep deprivation. Proof, like having a birthmark, clearly the devil's mark, or owning a cat, obviously a familiar spirit. Then there were the rebels who fought not for political power, but for survival. During the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536, tens of thousands of ordinary people, farmers, labourers, small tradesmen, rose up to protest the destruction of the monasteries. They weren't trying to overthrow Henry VIII. They were trying to preserve the institutions that fed them, educated their children, and cared for their sick. Henry crushed the rebellion and executed the leaders, but the suffering extended far beyond the scaffold. Families were destroyed, villages were punished collectively, land was confiscated, the social fabric of northern England was torn apart, and these people, the poor, the powerless, the forgotten, make up the vast majority of Tudor execution victims. They didn't get state funerals. Their deaths weren't commemorated. They were buried in unmarked graves or left to rot on gibbets as warnings. But they were human. They had names, families, dreams. They loved and laughed and hoped for better days. And they died violently, publicly, often for crimes that were nothing more than bad luck or being in the wrong place at the wrong time. When we talk about Tudor executions, we need to remember, it's not just the famous heads that rolled. It's the thousands upon thousands of ordinary people ground up by a system that valued order over mercy, power over justice, and royal authority over human life. Here's something they don't teach you in history class. Executions were profitable. When you were convicted of treason, the crown didn't just take your life, it took everything you owned. Your lands, your houses, your possessions, your money, all of it became crown property through a legal process called forfeiture. This wasn't a side effect, it was often the point. Henry VIII's treasury was constantly empty. He spent lavishly on wars, on palaces, on his court. When he broke with Rome and dissolved the monasteries, he didn't just do it for religious reasons, he did it for money. The wealth of the monasteries accumulated over centuries became his. And when that money ran out, he found other sources. Accusing wealthy nobles of treason became a convenient way to replenish the royal coffers. You didn't even need real evidence. A few suspicious letters, testimony from tortured servants, rumours of disloyalty. That was enough to convict, execute, and confiscate. The Duke of Buckingham, executed in 1521, was one of the richest men in England. After his death, Henry seized estates worth a fortune. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, became obscenely wealthy by managing the dissolution of the monasteries and skimming profits. When Henry turned on him, all that wealth reverted to the crown. Even Anne Boleyn's execution was partly financial. Her death freed Henry from any obligation to her family, and he could redistribute their titles and lands to new favourites who owed him everything. But it wasn't just the crown profiting from executions. Executioners were paid per head. The more people they killed, the more money they made. They also had the right to keep the clothing of the condemned, a valuable perk since many nobles were executed in expensive garments. There were professional informers, people who made their living accusing others of crimes and collecting rewards. These bounty hunters would gather gossip, extract confessions through intimidation, and present evidence to authorities. If the accused was convicted and their property confiscated, the informer got a cut. Even the crowds at executions were part of the economy. Vendors sold food, drink, pamphlets describing the crime and the condemned person's life. pickpockets worked the crowds. Entrepreneurs rented out prime viewing spots, windowsills, rooftops, platforms, for a fee. Execution days were good for business. And then there was the symbolic economy of terror. Every execution reinforced royal power. Every head on a pike reminded people who was in charge. The psychological impact, the fear, the compliance, the desperate loyalty was worth more than gold. The Tudors understood this instinctively. Violence wasn't just about punishment, it was about control. And control, in Tudor England, was the most valuable commodity of all. Let's zoom out for a moment and ask, was Tudor England uniquely bloodthirsty? Or was this just normal for the time? The answer is complicated. Executions were common across Europe in the 16th century. The Spanish Inquisition, the French Wars of Religion, the persecution of Anabaptists in Germany, violence in the name of religious and political order was everywhere. But even by those standards, Henry VIII's body count was extraordinary. Spain's Inquisition, which lasted for centuries and became synonymous with religious persecution, executed somewhere between 3,000 to 5,000 people over its entire history. Henry VIII killed more people in a single reign. The French Wars of Religion, which tore France apart for decades, resulted in thousands of deaths, but many of those were battlefield casualties, not judicial executions. What made Tudor England unusual wasn't just the scale, it was the systematization. The Tudors built a legal and bureaucratic apparatus specifically designed to identify, prosecute, and execute threats efficiently. Other countries had inquisitions and religious courts. England had a state machinery that could pivot from persecuting Catholics to persecuting Protestants, and back again, depending on who sat on the throne. The system was flexible, adaptive, and terrifyingly effective. Foreign ambassadors wrote home about the atmosphere in Tudor England. Venetian, Spanish, and French diplomats described a court where people spoke in whispers, where everyone watched everyone else, where a single misstep could mean death. They were shocked not by the executions themselves, every country had those, but by the casual efficiency, the sheer bureaucratic orderliness of it all. In many European countries, executions were relatively rare spectacles reserved for the worst crimes. In Tudor England, they became routine, expected, part of the social calendar. And that normalisation of violence, that acceptance of state-sanctioned killing as just how things were done, that was the truly revolutionary aspect of Tudor rule. They didn't just execute people, they made execution normal, boring even. And when violence becomes boring, when death becomes routine, that's when a society has truly lost its way. Tudor executions didn't just shape politics and law, they shaped English culture in ways that lasted for centuries. The theatre of Shakespeare and his contemporaries is soaked in blood. Tragedies filled with murders, betrayals, executions. They reflected the world the playwrights lived in. When Shakespeare wrote about the downfall of kings, about court intrigue and political murder, he wasn't being dramatic. He was being realistic. Many in his audience had seen executions. Some had family members who died on the scaffold. The famous scene in Richard III, where the young princes are murdered in the Tower, that wasn't ancient history to Tudor audiences. The Tower was right there, and people were still being executed in it regularly. Revenge tragedies, plays like the Spanish Tragedy and Titus Andronicus, filled with gore and violence, were wildly popular. Why? Because they gave audiences a safe way to process the trauma of living in a society where violence was constant and death was public. Ballads and pamphlets about famous executions circulated widely. These were the true crime podcasts of Tudor England. People were fascinated by the details, the last words, the behaviour of the condemned, the competence of the executioner. Some executions became legendary: the courage of Thomas More, the dignity of Mary, Queen of Scots, the defiance of Thomas Cranmer. These stories were told and retold, shaping how people thought about death, honour and resistance. But the cultural impact went deeper than entertainment. Tudor England developed what we might now call a surveillance culture. People learned to watch what they said, to be careful about who they trusted, to perform loyalty constantly. This affected language itself. People became masters of ambiguity, of saying things that could be interpreted multiple ways. You never wanted to commit too firmly to any position, because you never knew which way the political winds might shift. The concept of martyrdom took on new meaning. Both Catholics and Protestants elevated their executed members to near sainthood. These martyrs became powerful symbols, their deaths proof of their faith's righteousness. Books like Fox's Book of Martyrs, which detailed the persecution of Protestants under Mary I, became foundational texts. They shaped English Protestant identity for generations, creating a narrative of suffering and survival that defined the national self-image. And underneath it all, a deep cynicism developed. People learned not to trust authority, not to believe official narratives, not to assume that justice and the law were the same thing. The Tudor legacy wasn't just political, it was psychological. It created a national character shaped by trauma, surveillance, and survival. Let's talk about what actually happens to a body during Tudor execution methods, because the clinical reality is far worse than most people imagine. When you're hanged, drawn, and quartered, the standard punishment for male traitors, here's the process. First, you're hanged by the neck, but not long enough to die. Just long enough to lose consciousness, maybe? Sometimes the executioner cuts you down while you're still fully aware. Then you're laid on a table. The executioner slices open your abdomen. If you're conscious, you feel everything. There's no anesthesia, no mercy. Your intestines are pulled out slowly while you watch. The shock alone is often enough to kill, but not always. Your body is in agony, trying to understand why your insides are outside, your nervous system screaming. Then your genitals are cut off and burned in front of you. The symbolism is clear. Traitors don't deserve to reproduce, but the physical reality is torture beyond imagination. Only after all that, only after you've watched your own body being dismantled piece by piece, does the executioner finally cut off your head. Your heart, if it's still beating at that point, is cut out and held up to the crowd. "Behold the heart of a traitor," the executioner shouts. And then your body is quartered, cut into 4 pieces. Those pieces are sent to different towns and displayed on spikes as warnings. Dogs and birds often fed on the remains. In summer, the smell was unbearable. Now let's talk about burning at the stake. The condemned person is chained to a wooden post. Wood and sometimes coal is piled around their feet, sometimes as high as their waist. The fire is lit. If you're lucky, the smoke suffocates you before the flames reach you. Your lungs fill with smoke, you pass out, and you're dead before you burn. If you're not lucky, if the wind blows the wrong way, if the wood is damp and burns slowly, you experience what many historians consider the worst death imaginable. The heat is agonizing long before the flames touch you. Your skin reddens, blisters, and begins to crack. The pain is beyond description. When the flames reach you, your hair catches fire first, then your clothes, then your skin begins to char. The smell, your own burning flesh, fills your nostrils. Your eyes can literally boil in their sockets. Your tongue swells until it bursts. Your lungs scorch from the inside as you inhale superheated air. Some victims took more than 30 minutes to die. Half an hour of unimaginable suffering while crowds watched, some praying, some jeering. Even beheading, supposedly the merciful option, was often botched. A skilled executioner could sever the head in one blow. But many executioners weren't skilled. The Countess of Salisbury, as mentioned earlier, took 11 blows. Margaret Pole ran from the executioner while he hacked at her. She died slowly, in terror and agony. Mary, Queen of Scots, took 3 blows. The first struck the back of her head. She probably felt it. The second nearly severed her neck, but left a sinew of flesh connecting head to body. The executioner had to saw through it with the axe while she was still technically alive. These weren't anomalies, they were routine. And here's what makes it even more horrific. This was done in public. Children watched, pregnant women watched, families brought picnics. Tudor society was so saturated in violence that watching someone be slowly tortured to death became entertainment. The psychological damage to a population that grows up seeing this regularly is incalculable. Every Tudor monarch who ordered executions did so with the full backing of religious authority. God, they claimed, was on their side. Henry VIII broke with Rome and declared himself supreme head of the Church of England. Anyone who disagreed wasn't just committing treason against the king, they were committing heresy against God's appointed representative on earth. The logic was circular and airtight. The king speaks for God. God wants obedience. Therefore, disobeying the king is disobeying God. And disobeying God deserves death. Catholic theologians under Mary I used the same logic in reverse. The Pope speaks for God. Protestantism is heresy. Heretics damn themselves and others. Therefore, burning heretics is actually an act of mercy, saving other souls from contamination. Both sides quoted scripture. Both sides claimed divine mandate. Both sides genuinely believed they were doing God's work. But here's the truly dark part. Many of the condemned believed it too. Thomas More went to the scaffold, convinced that his death was righteous, that he was dying for God's truth. Protestant martyrs under Mary believed the same. They sang hymns as they burned, convinced they were earning eternal reward. The system didn't just kill bodies, it weaponized faith itself, turning religious conviction into a tool of state violence. Priests on both sides, Catholic and Protestant, preached that obedience to the crown was obedience to God. Rebellion was sin. Doubt was dangerous. The only safe position was absolute, unquestioning loyalty. And if you found yourself sentenced to death, well, God must have willed it. Perhaps you were being tested. Perhaps your death would serve some higher purpose. This theological framework made resistance almost impossible. You weren't just fighting the king or queen, you were fighting God. The psychological weight of that belief crushed potential rebellions before they could form. And for the rulers themselves, it provided perfect moral cover. They could order thousands killed and sleep soundly, convinced they were instruments of divine will. Henry VIII, even as he executed friends and wives, genuinely believed he was serving God. Mary I, lighting the fires that consumed hundreds, believed she was saving England's soul. The horror isn't just that they killed, it's that they did it with absolute moral certainty. But not everyone bowed, despite the overwhelming threat, despite the terror, despite watching friends and family die. Some people resisted. The Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536 was one of the largest popular uprisings in English history. 30,000 to 40,000 people marched, demanding the restoration of the monasteries, the removal of heretical advisors, and the preservation of traditional religious practices. They organised peacefully. They took oaths to remain non-violent. They presented petitions, not weapons. Henry VIII promised to hear their grievances. He invited the leaders to London for negotiations. It was a trap. Once the rebels dispersed, Henry ordered mass arrests. Around 200 leaders were executed. Others were imprisoned. The rebellion was crushed and the monasteries stayed dissolved. But the spirit of resistance didn't die. Underground Catholic communities formed during Elizabeth I's reign. Priests smuggled themselves into England, hiding in secret chambers built into the walls of sympathetic houses, priest holes they were called. They conducted mass in secret, kept the faith alive, and accepted that discovery meant execution. Many were caught, many died, but they kept coming. Protestant resistance under Mary I took different forms. Pamphlets circulated illegally, documenting the burnings, celebrating the martyrs, keeping Protestant theology alive. These writings sustained communities even as their leaders burned. And there was personal resistance, small acts of defiance that didn't make history books, but mattered immensely to those who did them. The servant who slipped extra food to a prisoner awaiting execution, the crowd member who prayed silently for the condemned instead of jeering, the scribe who accidentally lost incriminating documents, the executioner who angled the blade to make death quicker. These weren't grand gestures. They wouldn't overthrow tyranny, but they preserved something human in an inhuman system. Some resistance was more direct. There were at least a dozen serious plots to assassinate Elizabeth I. All failed, and the plotters died horribly. But they tried. Were they heroes or villains? It depends entirely on your perspective. To Catholics, they were martyrs trying to restore the true faith. To Protestants, they were traitors trying to murder the Queen. The same ambiguity applies to almost every execution of the Tudor era. One person's traitor is another's martyr. One person's heretic is another's prophet. What's undeniable is that resistance existed. It was crushed repeatedly and brutally, but it existed, and in a system designed to terrify people into absolute compliance, the mere existence of resistance was itself a victory, small, costly, and often fatal, but real. When Elizabeth I died in 1603 and the Tudor dynasty ended, England didn't suddenly become peaceful. The Stuart kings who followed inherited the machinery of violence the Tudors had built. James I, Charles I, the Civil War, Cromwell, the 17th century brought its own horrors. But something had shifted. The Tudor era taught England a brutal lesson. Absolute monarchical power, unchecked and unbalanced, leads to tyranny, and tyranny leads to rivers of blood. The English Civil War, in many ways, was a reaction to Tudor-style absolutism. Parliament fought against Charles I's attempts to rule without limits, to tax without consent, to imprison without trial. And when Parliament won, one of their first acts was to put the king himself on trial and execute him. Charles I was beheaded in 1649. It was a direct rejection of the idea that monarchs were above the law, that royal blood made you untouchable. Charles I died the same way his subjects had died for over a century, on the scaffold under the axe. The Tudor legacy wasn't just political violence, it was the seeds of political philosophy that would eventually limit that violence. Thinkers like John Locke, writing in the aftermath of the Tudor-Stuart bloodbaths, developed theories of natural rights, limited government, and the social contract. These ideas would influence the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the development of modern democracy. England eventually developed the concept of constitutional monarchy, a king or queen with severely limited powers, bound by law, unable to execute subjects at whim. It took centuries, and it came at an incalculable cost. But the lesson was learned. No one, not even royalty, should have the power of life and death over their subjects without checks and balances. The Tudor era also left cultural scars that lasted generations. The paranoia, the surveillance, the distrust of authority, these became embedded in English culture. It's why the English developed such a fierce attachment to civil liberties, why habeas corpus, the right not to be imprisoned without cause, became sacred, why the presumption of innocence and the right to a fair trial became foundational principles. Because they'd seen what happened without those protections. They'd lived through it. Their grandparents had died in it. The Tudor execution machine eventually destroyed itself. It created a population so traumatized, so mistrustful of absolute power, that they eventually said, "Never again." Not perfectly, not immediately, but eventually, and that perhaps is the only redemptive thread in this entire blood-soaked tapestry. Let's end where we began, with numbers. 57,000 to 72,000 executions under Henry VIII alone. Hundreds more under his children. But these aren't just statistics. Each one was a person. Someone who woke up that morning not knowing it was their last. Someone who had breakfast, said goodbye to family, walked to the scaffold. Someone who felt the rope around their neck, or the heat of the flames, or the cold edge of the axe. Someone whose last thoughts we can only imagine. Were they terrified, resigned, defiant, praying, cursing? For every famous execution we know, Anne Boleyn, Thomas More, Mary Queen of Scots, there are thousands we don't. The nameless, the forgotten. The teenager hanged for stealing to feed his siblings. The old woman burned for practicing herbal medicine. The farmer executed for defending his land. The priest killed for his faith. Each one left behind people who loved them. Mothers who would never recover from losing their children. Children who grew up without parents. Spouses who grieved alone. And the survivors carried trauma that shaped their entire lives. Imagine growing up in Tudor England. Imagine learning that one wrong word, one moment of defiance, one accusation from a neighbour could mean your death. Imagine never feeling safe, never speaking freely, always watching, always cautious, always afraid. That was life for millions of people across 5 reigns and over a century. The Tudor dynasty built an empire. They transformed England from a relatively minor European kingdom into an emerging global power. They presided over a cultural renaissance that gave us Shakespeare, Marlowe, and Spencer. But they built it all on a foundation of bodies. And the question we're left with, the question that haunts anyone who studies this era seriously, is, was it worth it? Did the political stability, the cultural achievements, the religious reforms, did any of it justify the mass slaughter? There's no easy answer. History doesn't deal in easy answers. What we can say is this: the Tudors showed us what happens when power is concentrated in the hands of individuals who face no meaningful accountability, when the law becomes a weapon instead of a protection. When fear replaces justice, they showed us the logical endpoint of absolute power, the scaffold, the stake, and the executioner's axe working overtime. And they left us with a warning written in the blood of tens of thousands. This is what tyranny looks like. This is what happens when rulers face no limits. This is the cost of absolute power. Never forget, never normalize, never look away. Because the moment we do, the moment we accept that violence in service of order is justifiable, that fear in service of stability is acceptable, that death in service of power is reasonable, that's the moment we risk becoming Tudor England. And history has shown us, once you start down that path, once the executioner's blade begins to fall, it's almost impossible to stop. So who was the bloodiest Tudor? By the numbers, it's not even close. Henry VIII killed more people than all his predecessors, contemporaries, and successors combined. But here's the deeper question. What does bloodiest even mean? Is it just about the body count? If so, Henry VIII wins by a landslide that would make any modern dictator jealous. Or is it about the nature of the killings? Mary I burned fewer people, but she burned them for their faith, slowly and publicly, creating martyrs who destabilized her reign and stained her legacy forever. Or is it about intent? Henry killed mostly for political expediency, removing threats, consolidating power, seizing wealth. Mary killed because she genuinely believed she was saving souls. Which is worse, cynical murder or righteous murder? Or maybe bloodiest isn't about the monarchs at all. Maybe it's about the system they created and perpetuated, a legal framework that made execution routine, a culture that normalized violence, a society that learned to watch its neighbours die and then go home and eat dinner. Because here's the thing, the Tudors didn't act alone. Every execution was approved by judges, witnessed by crowds, carried out by executioners who went home to their families afterward. Every religious persecution was supported by priests who preached obedience. Every political purge was enabled by informers who betrayed their neighbours for reward or safety. The Tudors built the machine, but thousands of ordinary people kept it running. And that perhaps is the most disturbing lesson of all. It's easy to look back and think, I would never participate in such horror. I would resist, I would refuse. But would you, when resistance means death, when silence means survival, when cooperation means protecting your family, what would you really do? Most people, throughout history, choose survival. They keep their heads down. They go along. They become complicit, not because they're evil, but because they're human. And humans, faced with overwhelming threat, do what they must to survive. The Tudor execution machine worked because ordinary people, good people, decent people, were willing to participate just enough to keep it running. The executioners who took the job because it paid well. The judges who signed death warrants because refusing meant their own deaths. The crowds who attended because not attending might mark you as suspicious. The neighbours who informed because they were afraid someone might inform on them first. Layer by layer, compromise by compromise, small act of complicity by small act of complicity, an entire society became an execution machine. And the worst part, most of them probably thought they were doing the right thing. Protecting England, defending the faith, serving justice, maintaining order. That's the lesson the Tudors teach us. Not just that absolute power corrupts, we know that, but that ordinary people, given the right circumstances, will participate in extraordinary evil. And they'll sleep at night. So tonight, as you lie in your comfortable bed, with your rights and freedoms and legal protections, take a moment to remember the thousands who didn't have those luxuries. Remember the teenager hanged for stealing bread, the old woman burned for her faith, the nobleman beheaded for speaking his mind, the common labourer executed for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Remember them. Not because they were particularly virtuous or because their deaths were particularly meaningful, but because they were human, and they died badly in a system designed to kill efficiently and without mercy. The Tudor dynasty ended over 400 years ago, but the lessons remain urgent. Power without accountability is dangerous. Law without justice is tyranny. Order maintained through fear is fragile. And once you normalise violence, once you accept that some deaths are necessary for the greater good, once you start building execution machines, they're almost impossible to dismantle. The Tudors knew that, their victims learned it, and we, centuries later, are still trying to understand it. Sweet dreams. And remember, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. Because the alternative is the scaffold, the stake, and the executioner's blade. And history has taught us it can happen again, anytime, anywhere, to anyone, unless we remember, unless we resist, unless we refuse to forget what happens when power goes unchecked and violence becomes policy. The Tudor dynasty is gone, but the warning remains. Never forget, never again.